Welcome back to Iron Destiny Props. Perhaps one of the greatest villains in all movie-making history is the character Darth Vader. And we're going to examine 3 of the prominent hilts that David Prowse wore on his belt in 2 of the original Star Wars films. These are all replicas of the original hilts used on set, but they're assembled using the same vintage parts that were used by the original prop builders. These 3 hilts are vintage MPP flash guns, and this is a Roman Props accurate replica flash gun, and I'd like to share with you the various details which make these screen accurate. So let's start with the very first lightsaber that appeared on screen in Star Wars, the first film in 1977. In the prop community, we call this the V1, since it is one of 2 main hero lightsabers that Prowse wore throughout the film. This is the hilt that can be seen as Vader boards Princess Leia's ship, the Tantive IV, in hopes of reclaiming the stolen plans of the first Death Star. All those scenes in the early part of the film aboard the ship feature this hilt. The only other times it is seen is when Lieutenant Tanbers reports to Vader on the problem of the rebel fighters' evasive maneuvers, and when Vader summons 2 TIE fighter pilots to join him in the space battle. Despite its very brief presence on screen, this is the most well-known of Vader's 2 A New Hope lightsabers. One of the most widely known photos of this hilt appears in the Chronicles reference book, which shows 2 side views of the hilt. In that photo, you can clearly see the one-step shroud, large wire D-ring, and straight knurled thumbscrew that you see here. More often than not, it seems vintage MPPs come with 2-step shrouds, and here is an example of that. As you can see, there is quite a difference between them, and collectors of the MPP know the considerable value and rarity it is to obtain a vintage one-step. All the Vader hilts in the films had this type of shroud, so this is a very special detail on this prop. A common feature that seems to be consistent with vintage one-step shrouds is this very heavy wrinkle-painted texture. 2-steps seem to have a much lighter wrinkle finish, but the 1-steps have quite a heavy paint. You can see on the original prop, as with this one, that the shroud was machined in such a way as to reveal a small portion of the flash gun tube, so that is accurate. The one detail that is not accurate to this hilt is the small B-port. To my knowledge, the original had a large B-port, which you see on this ESB. The clamp on the real hilt had a shiny black painted finish. Some vintage MPPs have more of a satin-finished clamp, but the screen-used prop had a shiny one with these flat and straight silver clamp bars. The bubble strip is harvested from a Texas Instruments Exactor 19 calculator, and you can see in the photo that it's sitting up high in the clamp rails as you see here. That led me to the conclusion there had to be something underneath elevating it up like that, and I cut the PCB board from the calculator so it could act as a platform to support the bubbles. There's no photo evidence yet that suggests or reveals what exactly the original prop builders used to support the bubble strip and the real clamp, but I think from purely a construction standpoint that this is accurate to the original. One of the most unique details on the real hilt is this bent nail. At some point before filming, the original clamp screw pin broke off or got lost, and so they improvised a solution using this simple common nail bent through the clamp bars and with the lever itself crimped on the stump. We used a replica Roman Props lever in order to preserve the original one, and even though it is quite a challenge to get the nail bent in the correct place, it keeps the clamp tight quite well. We went with WannaWanga T-track grips, and I custom cut each one to be accurate in length to those on the original. I also closely examined the reference photo in order to replicate the varied cuts on the ends of the grips. So this is the first Darth Vader hilt in Star Wars. Let's take a look at the second vintage we have here. This one is known as the V2, and it actually had the most screen time in the first Star Wars film. It appears in every scene where Vader is featured, except for those mentioned above, which used the V1. It's easier to spot on Vader's belt in the film due to a prominent silver scratch on the one side of the shroud here, and due to the lower seated clamp compared to the V1. Here we have another vintage one-step shroud with the heavy wrinkle finish, large wire D-ring, and straight knurled thumbscrew. This time we have the accurate small B port, just like the original hilt, and we have a real satin-painted clamp with straight black bars and a vintage lever. There are very few public reference photos of this particular hilt, but one of the best we have is a black and white taken during the filming of the scene where Vader orders Captain Kurgi to send a scanning crew aboard the Millennium Falcon. In that photo, you can clearly see these rectangular-shaped LEDs and the silver leads that protrude from the sides. The one major difference between this PCB and the original is the color of the board itself. The black and white image shows a white board behind the LEDs, and not this darkly colored one, so it seems clear that the real prop had a light-colored PCB. From what I've seen, the red LEDs paired with this bluish board is the most common variant found in the Exacta calculators, and I've seen a few dark tan or olive-colored boards as well, but not the lightly colored variant that seems to be present on the real prop. So hopefully we'll one day obtain new reference photos that show this hilt in color so we can identify the shade of the real PCB, but for now we'll have to rely on the knowledge we have. I decided to cut these 7 Todd's grips a little longer than the standard 92mm, since the reference photos show a smaller distance between the clamp and the bulb release greebly. So this is Vader's second lightsaber in A New Hope. Let's take a look at his hilt in The Empire Strikes Back. This is a vintage large B-port MPP. This is the unicorn of unicorns in the MPP collecting world. Vintage MPPs are quite difficult to find due to how few were made, and a large B-port variant is almost impossible to find now, so this is extremely special and a very unique prop indeed. This is a Wonawanga Gen 1 steel cast shroud. Roy is planning on a new run of these, so keep an eye out for that. But he designed this shroud based off of the reference photos of the original hilt, and that's why it has this thicker shroud wall in comparison to the much thinner wall of these ones. Since we elected not to weather these vintage parts, we decided to merely paint the shroud and leave it as is with the correct texture showing under the finish. Here we have Roy's accurate small-shaped D-ring and recently revised diamond knurled thumbscrew. We have the multicolored wires accurately installed according to the real hilt, and all the screws are faithfully oriented. Next we have a shiny black clamp with trapezoidal clamp bars. Now, whereas the previous 2 hilts had straight and flat bars, these are angular in shape. As with the V1, at some point the clamp lever got lost or was broken off, and the prop department used the lever pin assembled as you see here to keep the clamp shut tight over the bubble strip and PCB. These are real bubbles and a real blue PCB previously cut by Scott Juarez of Crucible Custom Props. The way the gold leads are oriented under the bubbles is exactly what you see on the original hilt. It's difficult to see due to the super glue that leaked between the bubble strip and PCB, but you can identify the board was a bluish color like this one. These are Todd's Costumes T-Track grips, and I chose to cut them a little longer than the commonly accepted 104mm due to the more accurate, smaller distance between the clamp band and bulb release greebly. I also made sure to cut this center grip a little longer so it extends in closer to the clamp bars, and made a few of these grips just a little shorter to remain faithful to the reference photos of the real prop. And for the sake of comparison, let's look at the Roman Props weathered MPP. This is an all-replica parts hilt, except for the vintage Highland multi-bulb socket that resembles these vintage MPP sockets almost exactly. Again, we have a WannaWanga D-ring and thumbscrew, multicolored wires, replica bubble strip, and sloth furnace blue PCB, and Todd's T-Track grips. I nicked up the flash gun tube to resemble a naturally worn MPP, and I decided to sand off all the original paint on the shroud and clamp. They come quite heavily painted from Roman Props, and it's a bit of a challenge to weather them accurately, so I stripped them and came back with accurate wrinkle paint for the shroud and gloss black for the clamp. It made the weathering process go much smoother, and I think the result looks much more authentic. In the case of the shroud, I went with my own interpretation of the original weathering. but the clamp weathering is an exact replication of the real hilt owned by Stephen Lane from the UK prop store. So every nick and scratch you see here is true to that prop. And there you have it, Darth Vader's main hero hilts from the first 2 original trilogy Star Wars films. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and feel free to comment, share, and subscribe, and follow me on my other social media. Thank you to Chris on the RPF for these outstanding vintage commissions. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.